They say love works in mysterious ways, but when a man with nothing marries a woman with everything, even if everything is hidden behind withered hands and weary eyes, it's rarely love they speak of. It's a gamble, a desperation whispered on the wind. For Silas, it was less a whisper and more a roar in his empty gut, a cold promise made under an indifferent sky. He stood before the old grand house on the hill, its stones weathered like the face of the woman within, and felt the weight of his own poverty like a physical shroud. Baroness Ilara Ainsworth was 71, a widow twice over, rumored to possess lands and a name that carried weight, though whispers of true wealth were just that, whispers. Silas, barely past 30, with calloused hands and dust ingrained in his very being, was the improbable groom. He was a man who had known only hard ground and harder luck, whose dreams had long ago curdled into the bitter taste of survival. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The air inside the house was heavy with the scent of aged wood and forgotten rosewater, a stark contrast to the dry, honest wind he knew. Ilara was not beautiful in the way young women were, but there was a stillness about her, a quiet authority that both unnerved and intrigued him. Her eyes, pale as faded denim, held a depth that hinted at stories untold, secrets held close like fragile birds. Their wedding was a muted affair. A handful of curious, tight-lipped townsfolk gathered more for the spectacle than the celebration. Silas felt their eyes on him, sharp and judgmental, dissecting his worn suit, his rough hands, the cynical tilt of his mouth. They saw a fortune hunter, a poor man looking to stake his claim on wealth, on comfort he hadn't earned, and perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. His intentions were a tangled mess of need and ambition, a desperate grab for stability in a world that had always kicked him down. He told himself he would be kind, that he would earn his keep, that he would provide companionship. But beneath those flimsy justifications lay the undeniable glint of opportunity. Life with Ilara was a strange rhythm. Days were long and quiet, filled with the creak of the old house, the distant lowing of cattle on the expansive, though seemingly unproductive land. Ilara spent her time in her study, surrounded by books and ledgers, her movements slow but deliberate. She spoke little, her voice a low murmur that seemed to belong to another era. Their conversations were sparse, functional, rarely delving into the spaces between words where true feelings resided. Silas found himself with little to do. The land required minimal attention. The household staff, a stern housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, and a stoic ranch hand, Thomas, seemed to resent his presence, carrying out their duties with frosty efficiency. He wandered the grounds, the vastness of it mocking his idleness. He felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage, the gold yet to be revealed. He started looking, subtly at first, not for money bags or buried treasure, but for clues, hints in the conversation, patterns in her habits, anything that might explain the gap between the Baroness's reputation and the apparent lack of readily available funds or bustling activity. He noticed small things: Ilara's careful rationing of supplies, the threadbare patches on some of the antique furniture hidden beneath decorative throws, the quiet desperation in Mrs. Gable's eyes when she spoke of the unpredictable market prices for livestock. Yet, alongside these signs of modest means, there were contradictions. The sheer scale of the land itself, the undeniable quality of the few remaining horses in the stable, the worn but clearly expensive jewelry Ilara occasionally wore, not for display, but almost as a private comfort. These inconsistencies pricked at his mind, fueling the initial spark of suspicion that had drawn him here. Was the secret fortune a myth the townsfolk had embellished? Or was it hidden, not in plain sight, but tucked away in the shadows of Ilara's life, guarded by her silence and the decaying grandeur of the estate? The slow rhythm of the house began to feel less like peace, and more like a carefully maintained facade, and Silas, the poor cowboy, found himself becoming a quiet detective in his own strange marriage. He watched Ilara, trying to decipher the language of her silences, the story in her faded eyes, the secrets held within the walls of this quiet, sprawling monument to a past he didn't know. He remembered the biting wind of the prairie, the way it stripped you bare, leaving you with nothing but the dirt under your fingernails and the empty ache in your gut. That ache was an old companion, one he'd tried to outrun his whole life. He'd seen men broken by it, turned to drink, to violence, to desperate schemes that rarely paid off. He'd promised himself he wouldn't be one of them, yet here he was, married to a woman older than his own mother, in a house that felt like a museum of faded glory. He thought of the saloon in Harmony Creek, the one where he'd overheard the whispers about the old Baroness. Wealthy as sin, they say, but tight-fisted as a vice. Got a hidden stash somewhere, mark my words. Drunken talk, perhaps, but it had lodged in his mind, a seed planted in barren soil. He'd been drifting then, working odd jobs, sleeping in stables, the future stretching before him as a long, dusty road with no turning. The idea of the Baroness, lonely and reportedly wealthy, had presented itself not as a romantic notion but as a practical solution, a desperate gamble. He hadn't intended to deceive her, not entirely. He'd been honest about his circumstances, or rather, hadn't lied about them. He was a poor cowboy, skilled with horses and cattle, but with no land, no savings, no prospects. Alara had simply nodded, her gaze steady, as if his lack of fortune was irrelevant. That had surprised him. It still did. Was she truly blind to his underlying motivations? Or was she simply resigned? He couldn't tell. He spent his days exploring the house, not with the eagerness of a new husband, but with the quiet calculation of someone searching. He examined the books in her study, filled with complex financial notations he didn't understand, dating back decades. He ran his hands over the dusty ledges, checking for loose floorboards. He tapped on walls, listening for hollow sounds. It felt clandestine, shameful, but the gnawing need inside him, the years of deprivation, pushed him forward. He justified it by telling himself he wasn't stealing. He was simply uncovering what was rightfully hers, perhaps even putting it to use in revitalizing the neglected estate. But the tremor in his hands, the quickening of his breath whenever he thought he might be close, told a different story. This wasn't just about fixing up a property. It was about the promise of wealth, the freedom it represented, the chance to finally shed the skin of the poor, desperate cowboy. He felt the irony of it like a sharp stone in his gut. He was married to a baroness, lived in a mansion, yet still felt the same gnawing emptiness that had driven him from the plains. The house held its secrets close, whispering them only in the creaks of the floorboards and the shadows of the corners, and Silas felt himself drawn deeper into its silent, complicated history. The routine of the house was punctuated by visits from the local priest, Father Michael, a portly man with a booming laugh that seemed out of place in the somber halls, and less frequent visits from a lawyer from the nearest town, Mr. Finch, a thin, severe man whose spectacles perched precariously on his nose. These interactions offered small windows into Alara's world, but they were frustratingly opaque. Father Michael spoke of Alara's charitable work, her quiet generosity to the less fortunate in the area, another contradiction to the rumors of her being tight-fisted. Mr. Finch discussed legal matters in hushed tones, speaking of land deeds, contracts, and investments in language that flew over Silas's head, but hinted at ongoing financial complexities, rather than straightforward wealth. Silas observed these meetings from a distance, piecing together fragments, trying to make sense of the puzzle. He felt like an outsider, not just to their conversations, but to Alara's entire past. She rarely spoke of her previous marriages, her life before this house, before him. It was a closed book bound tightly with the ribbons of time and sorrow. One afternoon, while Alara was meeting with Mr. Finch, Silas found himself drawn to a small, locked wooden chest in her study. It sat on a high shelf, almost hidden by stacks of old papers. His heart hammered against his ribs with a frantic, uncontrolled rhythm. This felt significant. Not just another dusty artifact, but something deliberately kept separate, locked away. He tried the handle. It was secure. He looked around, the room silent except for the low drone of voices from the parlor. He felt a surge of shame, quickly followed by the familiar, insistent pull of his need. He rummaged quietly through a drawer in Alara's desk and found a small, tarnished key. His hand trembled as he inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded deafening in the stillness. He lifted the lid slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not stacks of money or glittering jewels, but a collection of letters and a single, intricately carved wooden bird. The letters were tied with a ribbon, their edges softened by age. The bird felt smooth and cool in his hand, its detail exquisite. Disappointment washed over him, cold and sharp. Letters? A wooden bird? Was this it? Was this the extent of her secret fortune? Sentimental trinkets from a forgotten life? He picked up the bundle of letters, the paper brittle under his touch. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, but the language was not English. He frowned, trying to decipher the script. It looked vaguely European. He flipped through them, the foreign words blurring before his eyes. Then his gaze fell upon a date written on one of the envelopes. Decades ago. His attention was caught by a name repeated in several places within the letters. A name that seemed familiar, one he might have heard whispered by the townsfolk or mentioned obliquely by Mrs. Gable. He couldn't quite place it, but it felt significant, like a half-remembered melody. He felt a sense of unease, not from the disappointment of finding no money, but from the cryptic nature of the contents, the foreign language, the evident care with which they had been preserved. This chest wasn't about wealth in the way he understood it. It was about secrets of a different kind, woven into the fabric of Alara's past, and Silas felt a growing certainty that they were connected to the elusive fortune in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He quickly replaced the key, closed the chest, and returned it to its shelf, his mind now racing with new questions, the mystery deepening in unexpected ways. He couldn't shake the feeling of those letters, the foreign script, the unnamed dread they seemed to carry. That night the house felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He lay awake beside Alara, listening to her soft, even breathing, studying the faint lines etched around her eyes in the moonlight. What stories did she keep locked away? What secrets lay buried beneath the quiet surface of her life? He thought back to his own past, to the decisions that had led him here. There was a particular memory, sharp and painful, that often surfaced in the quiet moments. A dusty, sun-bleached memory of his father, a man with dreams as big as the sky and hands as empty as his pockets. His father had chased fortunes that never materialized, always one step behind, always grasping at smoke. Silas remembered the look in his father's eyes, a blend of hope and despair that was chillingly familiar now. He'd sworn he wouldn't end up like that, chasing phantoms. He'd vowed to be practical, to secure a future, even if it meant making unconventional choices. He remembered a specific incident, a time when his father had been convinced he'd found a rich vein of silver. They had spent weeks digging under the relentless sun, their backs aching, their hope dwindling with every shovelful of dirt. Silas, just a boy, had watched his father's transformation, the initial excitement slowly giving way to grim determination, then to a quiet, defeated resignation. The silver was never found. They were left with nothing but a hole in the ground, and the crushing weight of disappointment. That was the moment Silas decided he couldn't rely on luck, on finding something precious buried in the earth. He had to make his own way, seize his own opportunities, even if they came in the form of an aging Baroness and a mysterious, possibly imaginary, fortune. This marriage, this house, this slow unfolding mystery, it was all a consequence of that past, that deep-seated fear of ending up empty-handed, just like his father. He had learned to be guarded, to trust only his own instincts, to see opportunity where others saw only strangeness, and the strange opportunity he had grasped seemed now to be leading him not just to a potential fortune, but into a labyrinth of old secrets and unresolved histories. The letters, the foreign language, the guarded chests, they weren't just clues to wealth. They were fragments of a life lived before him, a life perhaps marked by its own form of searching, its own hidden pains and compromises. The name from the letters kept circling back, a half-formed thought at the edge of his mind. He finally placed it during a quiet dinner with Alara. She mentioned in passing a lawyer from a distant city who had handled some of her family's affairs decades ago. The name she spoke was the same one he'd seen in the letters. He was a complicated man, Alara murmured, her gaze distant. Worked closely with the family. She didn't elaborate, and Silas knew not to push. Her silences were fortifications, built over years of carefully guarded privacy. But the connection was made. The letters weren't just personal correspondence. They involved legal or financial matters, linked to a specific individual from her past. He needed to understand the language. He rode into the nearest town the next day, a dusty settlement that served as the hub for the surrounding ranches. He found the local schoolteacher, a kind, bespectacled woman named Miss Evans, and awkwardly explained his need to translate some old documents, claiming they were family heirlooms he was trying to understand. Miss Evans agreed to help, her curiosity piqued. She identified the language as German. Over the next few days, Silas visited her, bringing a few letters at a time, watching as the foreign words transformed into English. The contents were dense, filled with legal jargon, financial terms, and references to properties in a foreign country. They weren't about hidden gold or jewels. They were about investments, trusts, inheritances, and complex arrangements made long ago. And they spoke of a specific large sum of money, held in trust, contingent upon certain conditions. The name of the lawyer from the letters appeared frequently, alongside the name of Alara's first husband, a European baron. The picture that began to emerge was not of a hidden physical fortune, but of a complex financial legacy, tied up in international law and potentially difficult to access. The tension in Silas tightened. This wasn't a simple case of finding a hidden stash. This was something far more intricate, far-reaching, and potentially far more valuable, but also far more complicated to claim. He continued his subtle inquiries at the house. He paid more attention to Mrs. Gable's occasional reluctant gossip, listening for mentions of Alara's past. He learned that Alara had come from a prominent European family, married her first husband, the Baron, young, and moved to America after his death many years ago. The land they were on had been purchased then, a vast tract that seemed disproportionate to their apparent current means. Thomas, the ranch hand, spoke of previous attempts to develop parts of the land that had failed, costing the Baroness considerable sums. The pieces were slowly fitting together, but the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. The secret fortune wasn't a secret location. It was a secret arrangement, buried not in the ground, but in layers of legal documents and the passage of time. Silas felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The potential wealth was immense, greater than he could have imagined. But the path to it seemed fraught with obstacles requiring knowledge and connections he didn't possess. And there was still the core mystery. Why was it secret? Why had Alara lived a seemingly modest life when this potential wealth existed? The slow burn of his initial search had ignited a new kind of tension, one rooted in the complexities of Alara's hidden history and the potential consequences of unearthing it. He was translating another batch of letters with Miss Evans when he found it. A single letter, thicker than the rest, marked "Private and Confidential." Miss Evans hesitated, her kind face etched with concern. "This one seems different, Silas," she said softly. "More personal, perhaps?" He nodded, his throat suddenly dry. As she translated, the words on the page began to paint a different, darker picture. This letter was not from a lawyer, but from Alara's first husband, the Baron, written shortly before his death. It spoke not only of the financial trust, but also of a condition attached to it. A condition tied to an event from their past, a tragedy, a secret shared between them and the lawyer mentioned in the other letters. The condition was clear and chilling. The bulk of the inheritance would only be released upon Alara proving she had atoned for her part in this past event, as judged by the lawyer managing the trust, the same lawyer whose name appeared repeatedly. The letter hinted at guilt, at consequence, at a burden Alara had carried for decades. Silas felt a cold dread wash over him. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about a past sin, a hidden shame, tied directly to the fortune. The mystery wasn't just where the money was, but why it was conditional, and what Alara had done. He looked at the date of the letter, written just before Alara moved to America. It wasn't about atonement in some abstract sense. It was about escaping something, starting over, perhaps hiding from the consequences of that event. His own motives felt small and selfish in comparison to the weight of history this letter revealed. He looked at Alara that night with new eyes. Her quietness wasn't just resignation. It was perhaps the heavy silence of a soul burdened by a secret. Her careful rationing wasn't necessarily about lack of funds, but perhaps about a life lived in the shadow of this unresolved past. unable or unwilling to claim the fortune tied to such painful conditions. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had come seeking wealth, only to find a hidden history of guilt and a fortune shackled to a past tragedy. The tension in the house became a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. Silas couldn't look at Alara without seeing the words of that letter, the hint of a shared darkness that lay beneath her composed surface. He found himself watching her, not with the calculating eye of a fortune hunter, but with a troubled curiosity, a grudging empathy forming in the space where his ambition had been. He started paying attention to her expressions, the subtle shifts in her mood, the way she sometimes clutched a small smooth stone in her pocket, rubbing it between her fingers as if seeking comfort or strength. He noticed her nightmares, soft whimpers in the dark that she never spoke of in the morning. He saw the loneliness that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. He was no longer just the poor cowboy who married for money. He was a man entangled in a life far more complex and shadowed than he could have imagined. He decided he needed to know the full story, not just for the sake of the fortune, but because the mystery had burrowed deep into him, demanding to be understood. He subtly questioned Mrs. Gable again, pressing gently about Alara's life before America, her first husband, the circumstances of his death. Mrs. Gable was initially reticent, her lips pressed into a thin line. But Silas's persistence, combined perhaps with her own underlying affection for Alara, eventually wore her down. She spoke of a scandal, hushed up by the family, something involving Alara, her husband, and a business partner, the same lawyer mentioned in the letters. An accusation of financial impropriety, a collapse of a business venture, ruin, and then a death. The Baron's death had been sudden, unexpected. While officially ruled an accident, there had been whispers of despair, of foul play, of a secret that had destroyed him. Alara had fled shortly after, severing ties with her family and the past. The trust was established then, managed by the surviving lawyer, conditional on her proving she had not been complicit, that she had somehow made amends for the ruin and the death. It was a form of penance, imposed from beyond the grave or by a lawyer seeking control. Silas wasn't sure which was worse. The pieces clicked into place, forming a grim mosaic. The secret fortune was a heavy chain, binding Alara to a past she couldn't outrun, a fortune earned through, or perhaps tainted by, tragedy and potential wrongdoing. The weight of this knowledge settled upon Silas like a physical burden. He understood Alara's silence now, her guardedness, the quiet sorrow that seemed to emanate from her. She wasn't just hiding wealth. She was hiding a life, a choice, a consequence. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had sought to grasp this fortune, and felt a profound sense of unease. He had come here seeking an escape from his own past, his own poverty, only to find himself trapped in the far more intricate, far more dangerous history of another. The house felt less like a cage now and more like a mausoleum, holding the ghosts of Alara's past, and Silas wondered if he was now destined to become one of them. The confrontation was inevitable. The knowledge was too heavy to carry alone, the questions too insistent to remain unspoken. One evening, after a dinner eaten mostly in silence, Silas found Alara in her study, tracing the spines of her books with a frail finger. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the words catching in his throat. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the history of the house and the secrets it held. "Alara," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned slowly, her eyes pale and ancient meeting his. There was no surprise in them, only a deep, weary resignation. It was as if she had been expecting this moment, preparing for it in the quiet solitude of her study for decades. He didn't know how much she knew he knew, so he started cautiously, speaking of the old letters, the German script, the translations. As he spoke, a subtle tension hardened her features, her hands tightening on the back of a chair. He mentioned the lawyer, the trust, the conditional inheritance. Her gaze didn't waver, but a shadow seemed to fall over her face. Then he spoke of the last letter, the one from her husband, the one about the condition, the atonement, the past event. And finally, he spoke of the whispers he'd heard, pieced together from Mrs. Gable's reluctant words, the scandal, the ruin, the death. He laid it all out, not as accusations, but as questions, as a man seeking understanding in the face of overwhelming mystery. "What happened, Ilara?" he asked, the words soft but heavy with the weight of everything he'd learned. "What secret is this fortune tied to?" Ilara remained silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on something only she could see in the distance. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the stillness, marking the passage of time, the years that had led to this moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, raspy, carrying the echoes of pain long suppressed. She didn't offer excuses or justifications. She told him the story simply, starkly, like recounting a historical event rather than a personal tragedy. It was a tale of ambition, betrayal, and a desperate choice made in a moment of crisis. Her first husband, the Baron, was brilliant but reckless in business. He had entrusted a significant sum to a partner, the lawyer, for an investment scheme that promised vast returns. Ilara had been against it, sensing the risk, but had ultimately gone along with her husband's wishes, even signing documents she didn't fully understand under pressure. The scheme collapsed, leaving them ruined. In the fallout, confronted by the lawyer and facing disgrace, the Baron had taken his own life. The lawyer, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps to protect his own reputation, had arranged the conditional trust, ensuring the money would remain inaccessible until Ilara somehow proved she had atoned for her part in the tragedy, her complicity, her failure to prevent it, her role in the ruin that led to his death. It was a cruel twist of fate, a fortune offered only as a burden, a constant reminder of a past she couldn't escape. Ilara finished her story, her voice barely a whisper, the silence in the room deafening. The truth was not a gleaming treasure, but a heavy stone dropped between them. Silas felt the full force of it then, the depth of her suffering, the years lived under this shadow, the cruel irony of her situation. He had sought a simple path to wealth, but he had found a woman carrying the weight of a lifetime's penance, her fortune a constant, bitter reminder of a single devastating event. The climax wasn't about finding the money. It was about confronting the terrible cost of it, the human toll exacted by ambition, betrayal, and a secret that had festered for decades. The silence that followed Ilara's confession was heavy, laden with the weight of decades of unspoken pain and unresolved grief. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the elderly Baroness he had married for convenience, but a woman profoundly marked by tragedy, her fortune not a source of comfort, but a monument to her greatest sorrow. The irony was sharp and unforgiving. He, the poor cowboy, seeking escape from his own lack, had stumbled into a life defined by the crushing burden of having and losing everything that mattered. He thought of his father's empty hands, his shattered dreams, and saw a different kind of emptiness in Ilara's eyes, the emptiness of a soul that had paid an unbearable price. The fortune, once the object of his desperate ambition, now seemed tainted, a poisoned chalice. The resolution wasn't about claiming the money. It couldn't be. Not now. The true value wasn't in the wealth itself, but in what it represented, a life consumed by a past that refused to let go. Silas didn't know what to do with this truth. He hadn't planned for this. He had come seeking material gain, not emotional entanglement in a decades-old tragedy. But looking at Ilara, fragile yet resilient, he felt a shift within him. The hardened shell of his cynicism began to crack, revealing something softer, something akin to compassion. He saw the years of quiet suffering, the dignity with which she had carried her burden, the subtle acts of charity Mrs. Gable had mentioned, perhaps her own quiet attempts at atonement, seeking forgiveness not from a cruel legal clause, but from her own conscience. He didn't speak of the money then, or the lawyer, or the potential for claiming the inheritance. Those things seemed distant, secondary to the raw, exposed wound of her history. Instead, he spoke of the quiet days they had shared, the rhythm of the house, the unexpected comfort he had found in her presence, despite his flawed intentions. He spoke of the western sky he knew, vast and indifferent, and how even under that indifferent sky, there were moments of unexpected beauty, of connection. He didn't offer platitudes or easy forgiveness. He simply offered his presence, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared space they now inhabited, a space filled not with the promise of gold, but with the heavy reality of a life lived in the shadow of a devastating secret. Ilara looked at him, her pale eyes searching his face. Perhaps she saw the change in him, the shift from calculation to something more human. A faint, fragile smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had ever seen. It was a smile of weary understanding, of acceptance, perhaps even of a faint, unexpected hope. The future remained uncertain. The fortune was still tied to the past, a knot of legal and emotional complexities that seemed insurmountable. Silas was still a poor cowboy, and Ilara was still the Baroness burdened by her history. But in that moment in the quiet study, under the soft glow of the lamplight, something shifted between them. It wasn't the love story the townsfolk might have scoffed at, but something quieter, deeper, a shared understanding of loss, of consequence, of the heavy, complex weight of a life lived. The road ahead was still dusty and long, filled with the unresolved echoes of the past. But for the first time since he had stood before the grand old house seeking his fortune, Silas didn't feel entirely empty-handed. He had found something unexpected, something far more profound than wealth, a shared vulnerability, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of hope for a future built not on hidden gold, but on the difficult, messy foundation of shared reality. The silent, watchful house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this unexpected connection could withstand the weight of the secrets it contained.